seasons are changing, and maybe governments too. This is a difficult day to vlog on. Just for some context, I've largely sequestered myself from media of all kinds, mainstream, social, and otherwise, because I found that during the difficult time of a pandemic, additional stress about elections and other such things was definitely causing me to question my mental sanity. Add to that the government in British Columbia, Canada, where I live, decided to call a snap election. I had to concentrate on voting for that and turning out for my party of choice, the NDP. On the provincial level, that vote actually does contribute because the NDP actually have a chance to win at the provincial level for complicating reasons. I've already noted before that since I was very young, I've voted as far left as I possibly could, including sometimes for defunct parties such as the Marijuana Party, even if I myself never indulge in such things. The reason why is manyfold, and has only been solidified by the information that I've been able to collect firsthand as an adventure traveler to 101 countries. But since today might be such a momentous occasion, I'll recall a story from Cambodia back in 2016. That first trip was my first solo backpacking trip as defined completely solo. I'd been adventure traveling since 2013, but I'd done so organizing trips for a couple of people very close to me. Starting in 2016, I traveled solo, but with help and infrastructure. First to Dubai on a work-play assignment that covered many of the normal travel costs like accommodations. And second to Atlantic Canada, where I was in a comfortable, modern country, the country of my birth, but I used some more creative ways to have my accommodations covered. That trip to Cambodia was my third in the year of 2016 and would have me gone total for 2 months, so 6 months total in the year of 2016. Cambodia was one of the major driving forces and highlights, Angkor Wat in particular, but being the efficient, productive traveler that I am, I decided that in the area I would cover all of Southeast Asia in order Thailand, I think some QAnoners or Trump supporters are trying to infiltrate my vlog. I'll just continue from where I left off and hope that both vlogs bridge together, because I am going to dance today, as I always do every Wednesday, and I've yet to even dance, so I'll have to continue going, because each vlog has to have at least some dancing. That's my own personal choice. Continuing on with my Southeast Asia story of 2016, I thoroughly explored all of Southeast Asia, starting in Thailand, then Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Indonesia, and Philippines. Am I missing anything? I have them all. Okay, so that trip happened in the fall of 2016, right around the time of the US presidential election. Now, I never really followed US politics in particular, but that's the type of event that basically crosses even into people who largely keep themselves in their own bubble. To clarify, as I mentioned in the previous vlog that will hopefully be a bridge to this, I really try to keep myself out, because as much as media tries, it's also a biased narrative. Sometimes you need that biased narrative to make decisions, but oftentimes maybe it's best to rely on other sources, other expert sources, because the news is still filtered across several different interpretations. Unless you're actually reading the words on paper or hearing the words through oral mediums, direct from the experts' mouths, the information is still being interpreted through a person, that being the journalist. As someone who actually applied to a Master of Journalism program, I know that they're actually very weak at summarizing scientific and otherwise logical data if they lack either a legal or technical background. Am I trying to punch down on arts grads? No, but the fact is they have a different skill set. Maybe they know how to write very well, maybe they even know how to write under time constraints and deadlines, but pound for pound, when it comes to analytical, analyzing skills, I think that lawyers and engineers have that leg up. That's just the way it is. They're trained differently. They're trained that way. I think that journalists also have a level of training in that type of analysis, but it's less than the average lawyer or engineer. Because you can technically become a journalist without a journalism background per se. Many people used to do it even without any training whatsoever. Now people are self-anointing themselves as journalists. So there's a question of credibility, and there's always been. In any case, what I'm saying is that the election was something that even someone like me, who largely wanted to keep to myself and in my own bubble, paid attention to. But I could, at that time, find solace in the fact that polls had Hillary Clinton ahead. So I was backpacking, solo backpacking, legitimately solo backpacking for the first time in my life abroad. So That's what I was worried about. That's what I was thinking about. Until Cambodia. When I arrived in Cambodia, all started well. We actually were in Cambodia around the time of their own independence holiday. So I was enjoying fireworks, the sounds, the smell of explosives, but the light of hope. That's when the US election results started to come in. And although I'm normally quite secure in myself, I broke down and cried. Actually, things were so bad in Cambodia that the next day, when I was walking around town, visiting some of their cultural sites, people noticed that I spoke English with an obvious North American accent. They assumed I was from the US, and they actually apologized to me and gave their condolences that my country had elected Donald Trump. My so-called country had elected Donald Trump. I found that to be mind-blowing, because I had just come off of learning about the dictator Pol Pot in Cambodia. And I just visited the killing fields of Cambodia. Some of Pol Pot's sympathizers are still in government in Cambodia today. And Pol Pot happened only a couple short decades ago. Suffice to say, there are a lot of facts and stories surrounding it, but the most visceral part of visiting the killing fields was the glass monument of skulls and other human remains. What happened is that they unearthed so many people that had been killed in these killing fields, people who were against Pol Pot in their own ways. They found so many remains that they had to organize them, and they could organize them based on very specific criteria. For example, there was a whole layer, I think, dedicated to baby skulls killed various manners. Here's by bayonet, here's by another way, here's by another way. This glass monument was a couple stories tall. I just remembered to myself thinking, what is this all for? A relative asked me why I travel, why I'm interested in animals, why I'm interested in any of the things I've done. Because I really suffer for my art. When I recall stories of being essentially homeless in Europe to execute on my dream of affording guerrilla trekking in Africa, people are somehow astonished. I know why they are astonished, but to me, that's what I'm going to use this life for. To do the things I want to do, and I'll make it happen however I need to make them happen. Okay? I've already mentioned several times to friends and to this vlog as well that I would not have chosen to be here in this life of suffering if I had had a choice. Now, what do I mean by life of suffering? Because I've also simultaneously stated that I'm self-actualized as much as I can be. What it means is that I understand the nature of this world, and the nature of the world has constraints. And even if I've self-actualized as best as I can, I've had to do it within the constraints of what this world is. And guess what? Every single person you might look up to has had to do the same thing. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Lady Gaga, whoever you look up to. You make the mistake of thinking that there is a form of life where there will be no suffering. That's just not true. Just the fact that Bill Gates knows that he'll die alone is enough suffering, I feel, to justify nobody coming in here. Because first of all, chances are you're not going to self-actualize the way I have. And that's a harsh truth. How I'm so confident saying this is because I know people around me, and I'm very rare. Part of how I've been able to self-actualize is I think that I'm a mutant. I was actually born maladaptive. Some people might use maladaptive as a pejorative, but I use it as a positive. It's positive because being maladaptive has allowed me to break out of this cage that we're all basically slaves to. Richard Dawkins, the famous biologist, in his book The Selfish Gene, explores this idea. He summarizes it as roughly, we as organisms are throwaway survival machines for the genes which we contain. How does that make anyone feel? Well, to me, it actually resolves life's mysteries, if there are any. Evolution just happens. T minus however many years ago, billions, or we'll even rename it as T0, the Big Bang. Shit happened. The laws of physics and chemistry held. Gene replicators, with millions and millions of years floating around, found chaotic and then stable arrangements. From those stable arrangements, they happened upon replication. And from replication, they just learned fancier ways to replicate. Till today, they built bodies, brains, that mostly were suited to replicating, because that's what they just did. So here's where things can go awry. Humans developed self-awareness in a way that is unique in the animal kingdom. People started being able to think, or at least they had the illusion of coming to some sort of conclusion by themselves, or even within the framework of what I've just explained, maybe some, like me, were mutants, and they were born without that urge to gene replicate. Now, seems like a very highbrow discussion about biology, and I'll probably have to work on this because I'm literally spitballing here, but my ability to not do the thing that, let's say, genes have just been doing for millions and millions of years represents both a burden and an opportunity. The burden is I have to be very creative. I have to seek. I have to find in ways that people who just settle into that replicating mode never have to. But to me, that seeking is literally the only thing that makes this pointless life have meaning, at least in my opinion. I personally don't think that replicating is meaning enough. I actually don't think that provides me meaning at all. So I've said no, I ain't replicating. I ain't having kids. But that also means that I can forward a message to people, which is, despite what your genes have done for millions of years, maybe if you were to really think about it, that's not what you want. Obviously, for someone like me, where I already knew, and in some ways probably genetically I was predispositioned to know exactly what I didn't want, which is I didn't want kids, things are much easier for me. I have essentially a blank canvas to explore the world that we accidentally happened to evolve into. And the funny thing is that none of it was by design. None of it was someone thinking, okay, we're going to evolve primates into this, into that, and then we'll have the internet. There's no God out there that I think is authoring all of that. It just happened. But the interesting thing is that it happened, and I happen to like some of the things that have happened in the world. Okay? Not the suffering part, but the knowledge part, the creativity part. So while I wouldn't have chosen to be here myself, now that I'm here, I find things that drive me far beyond the typical fucking, sucking, touching, family, and marriage. Now this is not a MGTOW thing. Men go their own way, red pill. This is not that. Because men go their own way, red pill is about blaming other people. And in some ways I can understand the inclination to want to do that. But if I'm going to be very generous to even my parents, I'll remove the blame for a second. I'll just enjoy what is able to be enjoyed in this life. And then, when things get to be too much, which they inevitably will, there's a certain matrix that justifies euthanasia, and then I'll go for that. So here's the thing. I think that euthanasia should actually be expanded far beyond what's legal in Canada. But I think by the time I'll have to contend with that, it will be expanded. Because people are starting to realize that this game of suffering might not be worth it, but especially not yours to burden onto other people. So when I say this, I mean that even if a baby might technically start in a woman's body, eventually that baby comes out and becomes its own human being and has to face the same life full of suffering that the woman knows about. And what gives that person the right to downward force suffering onto another without their consent? The funny thing is I meet parents and they have a lot of expectations of kids. Oh, when you're 18, you should, show me the contract. Show me the motherfucking contract where that baby signed. Because the funny thing is that those contracts are not enforceable by law, even if you somehow obtained a baby signature, which you can't. I'm being facetious. So I think people have to think about this idea of consent, because if consent matters to you in terms of sexuality, and consent matters to you in other questions of life, then I challenge you to extend that to the preborn. Where their rights and who's advocating on their behalf. Because the thing is that forevermore, the nature of parenting is that you're basically forcing your gamble onto someone else's life, and then you get mad when that gamble doesn't pay off, either in the form of your kid not acting the way or not becoming the way you want, or even worse, your kid suffering. Your kid might suffer mentally, physically. At the very least, I always say, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos have to think about the concept of death, and that's not easy for anybody. So, I've gone on an antinatalist tangent. I'll connect it back to that story of Cambodia and Donald Trump. Part of why I cried was because of the nature of the suffering of this world. And I used to be more concentrating on my limitations as a woman, but I'd largely climbed out of it with the adventure traveling. I'd achieved many goals that I'd set out that were ambitious, but they were important to me and the people I was traveling with. By late 2015, I'd already explored all 7 continents, and that was my first and only actual travel goal. I wanted to do that before my mom died, and that'll be a completely separate discussion and a separate vlog for another day. But suffice to say, I'd spent enough time convincing myself that I'd made a lot of inroads, and that as much as my gender might affect my ability to adventure travel, I largely worked around it. When I discovered that Donald Trump had won, for something that had been so far removed from me before, became suddenly very personal, because for whatever reason, but for very good reasons still, I felt like him being elected was somehow the world telling me that I can't be a female adventure traveler. Now obviously I've since worked over that, because starting from Trump and onwards in the last 4 years, I've actually adventure traveled more and more, boldly, passionately, and reached further and further than I ever imagined. But I bring this up because it's something that I'm going to have to think about. As of the time of right now, 4:30 p.m. Pacific on November 4th, the projections are that Biden will win. And does that change things for me and my ideas of being a woman adventure traveler? That remains to be seen. I think in some ways I've laid some general groundwork for future discussions, and I'll leave it at that, because I want to get to the dancing. A little dancing. It's a bit slippery again. Slippery out in this area, so I have to avoid it. Okay, well, I was obviously a little bit more distracted today because I had an entire spiel that was in some ways inspired and motivated by the election. By the way, at least in BC, my party won. The party's doing, I think, as good a job as you can expect given what human nature is in the world. I think we can continue to aspire to be better, but we have to admit that sometimes you just have to pick the best of two choices. You can label them as the lesser of two evils. You can tag it how you want. But the reality remains that sometimes you have to be strategic in how you vote. And you have to, in some ways, lower your expectations to being realistic. Because sometimes in trying to achieve what you would consider utopia or perfection, a worser case scenario can happen. And Trump's proved that. So, hopefully next week, I'll be able to call well, like I said, maybe even in a Biden administration, I still have a lot to think about.